So what's topping the agenda right now?
How that was going to hit the...
Well, you know, Mark just laid out very eloquently some of the issues facing the central banks around the world, including, of course, the BOE. And those central bankers are here in Niigata, up in northern Honshu, north of Tokyo, for these G7 meetings. The finance ministers and central bank meeting, and then, of course, we have the leaders meeting at the end of next week in Hiroshima. But right now, of course, the global economy and as well, of course, the debt ceiling impasse in the United States could overshadow. But with inflation still sticky in Europe, some of these European Central Bank leaders will be addressing those concerns. You know, Christine Lagarde obviously will be here. She has said, you know, the tightening there at the ECB is not over, even as the Fed is likely on pause right now. Even the RBA, of course, resumed tightening after its pause. Will the BOE do the same thing as well? So there's a lot of issues about sticky inflation, even though U.S. CPI did come down a little bit in April to 4.9% year over year. But again, financial system resiliency, given the collapse of the banks in the United States, including SVB, that will be front and center of many people, including, of course, Janet Yellen, who will likely address the press later this afternoon when this G7 finance ministers and central bank meeting begins this afternoon, 2:30 local time. She will give a press conference, likely, we're hearing from sources, kind of to reassure fellow G7 members and economies going to be resilient through these troubles.
How significant is it that Japan's also invited finance ministers from select non-G7 countries this time?
It is significant given the geopolitics right now. Obviously, there's the issues of friendshoring, of that Janet Yellen has used that term about supply chain resiliency. And keep in mind, China is not here. Obviously, they're not a member of the G7. So you have like-minded democratic nations and economies gathering here. And they've also invited what's being termed the Global South, representatives, finance ministers from Brazil, from Indonesia, from India, as well as Singapore and South Korea, of course, coming on the heels of Kishida's visit to South Korea. So there is some better relations, of course, across the Sea of Japan, between Japan and South Korea. But again, inviting Brazil, Indonesia, India, they're trying to get a coalition, if you will, beyond just G7 in light of those supply chain issues with China. And it doesn't help the situation for China in G7's eyes when they are essentially giving support to Moscow. Not necessarily the support for the war in Ukraine, but the perception, of course, is that. So there is going to be efforts here behind the scenes to get India, to get Brazil, which is maybe a more tricky situation following Lula da Silva's visit to Beijing, but get these global South nations on board here at the G7 finance ministers and central bank governors meeting in Niigata.